Good morning, everybody. How are you doing today? Check in. It's good to see you. Let me get on my phone and see who I've got on the chat going on. Let's see. YouTube. Where's my YouTube channel? Hi, Kircho. Kircho was talking to me on the other line. Let's see. I hope everybody saw the whoa, saw the neuromatrix results from this week. We've had a couple of changes up at the top. Very interesting stuff this week. I can't wait to finish my little broadcast update on it. Should be available tomorrow, and I'll let you know how everybody did. So let's see. Let me check the comments real quick. Buenos dias to you, Keelan. Good to see you. Guten Morgen to Ash Cuth. And the weekend was spectacularly gorgeous, right? Just the right amount of chill, the right amount of sun. It's freaking beautiful, right? Fantastic. So how's everybody else doing? Hey, Michael Kircho is back on now. It's good to see you. Edda. Hello. I thought you were going to say hello in Polish, Edda. We've got Guten Morgen and a Buenos Dias. Drive Shack. Ooh, that's that golf place, isn't it? Right? Look at that. He finally wore a collared shirt. Yes, folks, I actually do have dress-up clothes, but it's pandemic time, so who cares anymore, right? I wish I could say that, dear. I wish. You'll have to help us. Ooh. You'll have to help us pronounce that in the Tuesday webinar, okay, when you show up. Not that hectic. I had my dad's birthday on Saturday. We made some ribs. Nice. Ribs on a beautiful weekend, grilling out. That's a great idea, Riley. Happy birthday to your dad. Mom, my dog. Ooh, lots of doctor's appointments. Wow. Okay, thank you. So tomorrow, Edda's going to teach us all just a little bit of Polish in the 8 p.m. webinar. I hope everybody makes it there. Right. What's the new job, Ash? Bonamane. So Michaela's throwing in a little bit of Latin there. Somebody took Latin in high school. I'm a hard teacher and demanding. Uh-oh. There you go. We're going to get that Eastern European education tomorrow night, folks. I'm telling you, they don't play out there in the Eastern Bloc, right? Massage therapy. I've actually heard that that's really tough on the hands and wrists. Look at that, and Maya's talking to her. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Looks like we've got about 19 people in here so far, and wow, I don't know if I'm coming to class on Tuesday night, if Edda's going to be here. Maybe you folks can do it. Hi, Morgan. Okay, fantastic. We got a good crowd, so let's go ahead and talk about Chapter 6 this week. So we're going to talk a little bit about the behaviorist perspective this week, today. I'm going to sort of introduce the behaviorist perspective. Then I'm going to talk about one form of behavior acquisition that the behaviorists talk about, which is classical conditioning. Then I'm going to talk specifically about a case study of a little toddler named Little Albert. I'll bet some of you know. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how you might use classical conditioning to treat phobias or anxiety. Good morning, Brady. Good to see you. All right. So, one way we change, and we talked about this in developmental psychology, is through genetically programmed change, right? So we myelinate. And we have these things called critical periods when the environmental exposure is important, but it actually has to happen at a certain time. So one way to think about human beings as evolving is through what we would call maturational processes, right? Genetically programmed processes of myelination and stimulation during critical periods. Now, what we're going to consider today is a completely different tradition that looks at how environmental exposure changes us at any time. So what are the basic processes by which human behavior and thinking changes. Specifically, we're going to focus on behavior. All right. And you can tie this to dendritic spreading, blooming, and pruning, but the behaviorists never did that. So we're not going to talk specifically about that, but you can think of this as maybe representing the blooming and pruning of the developmental process. Now, there are different types of learning, of behavior change. All right. And so you can think about habituation, acclimating to things and being surprised by things. That's one way in which our behavior is changed. And then we can also talk about looking and modeling our behavior after people we see doing things, all right? And so you can think of non-associative learning as sort of biological and watching others as very, very cognitive. But the behaviorists were interested in what we'll call associational learning, okay, or associative learning. And this is sort of this little area in the middle right here. And we're going to talk about classical conditioning today, and we're going to talk about operant conditioning on Thursday. Classical conditioning is learning by association. It's a passive form of associative learning. And operant conditioning is learning by consequence, which is an active form of associative learning. All right, so we're going to focus in behaviorism on just the blue part of this bubble, if you will. All right, now behaviorists is interested in learning, and let's describe learning as a behaviorist would. It's a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. Two things that I want you to notice about this definition. Number one is it's a relatively permanent change. Associative learning is not permanent learning. Things can be learned and then forgotten. And number two, you'll notice that we describe learning as a change in behavior. Now, typically when you think of learning, you think of cognitive learning, what we're doing in here, thinking about ideas and stuff like that. The behaviorists weren't interested in that kind of learning. They started out with animal models, studying pigeons and rats and dogs and animals that don't necessarily talk and don't necessarily think in a way that's easy for us to observe, so they focused on changes in behavior. This is going to have some important implications as we get further in behaviorism this week. All right, so behaviorism's interested in associative learning. Now, here's the thing. Behaviorists developed their theories in response to two things that were going on in American science in 1900. The first was the eugenics movement, which said that everything was genetic and you were either born poor of poor mind, or you were born of good mind. It didn't take into account your environment, your poverty level, anything that had to do with your situational experience. And eugenists wanted to sterilize people based on their IQ scores. In fact, they did that for many decades here in America. And so the eugenics movement said that we were born a certain way. Now, the behaviorists did not believe this. And the second thing was the psychological tradition that existed in 1900. This guy named Sigmund Freud was very, very popular. And he had a very non-scientific approach to psychology. And he was saying all kinds of crazy things about how people had these sexual thoughts running around in their brains. And behaviorists like John Watson didn't think that was very scientific. All right? So, John Watson, when he became president of the APA, gave an address where he sort of, in the early 1900s, where he identified what he called the behaviorist principles. And he argued that, number one, all human functioning is learned through environmental experience. In a sense, we all have the same potential. We are all equipotential. But what differentiates you and me, our preferences and our abilities, is all dependent upon our environmental experience. Number two, he was very disappointed in Sigmund Freud and his theories of penis envy and castration, anxiety, and other things that really we're not even going to talk about in this class. We'll mention them a little bit in chapter 13. But Sigmund Freud was saying some really crazy things about what was going on in people's mind. And John Watson said, you know what? You can't measure the mind, so we are not going to concern ourselves with the mind. So he thought that mental functioning cannot be studied scientifically, so let's not even pay attention to it. Instead, the only thing he did was study learning in terms of how behavior changed. So I would say, in a sense, that if I'm judging whether or not you learned, I have to look at your behavior, what you write on the test. If your behavior is a certain way, then I know you have learned. We don't even need to think about what's going on in the mind. Does that make sense? I've got a couple of comments that I'm going to talk about in just a second from the class. Now, these folks also used a lot of animal models. They didn't do this on purpose at first. It's just the tradition of how this research methodology started. So they studied pigeons, dogs, rats, and in a sense, began to train these animals to do pretty special things. And when they started to teach these animals to do really complex behaviors, they began to believe in a philosophy of behaviorism that suggested that really there's no differentiating line between human and beast. And we really shouldn't think about the mind as being anything of value. Instead, we should just focus on nothing but the environment. Okay? So, I'm going to answer a couple of questions here. Let's see. Imitation is the best form of flattery. Let's focus on that. I agree. Environment does create our behavior. Etta, environmental forces are very important in shaping our behavior. There are limitations, and genetics does play a role, but the environment is very powerful. And what the behaviorist model does is it sort of examines the processes by which the environment shapes our behavior. Now, behaviorism went really off the track, Etta, and began to suggest that the environment was the only thing. And what I want you to do at the end of this lecture is to appreciate that there are innate qualities about you that the environment cannot change, but within your genetic set point, the environment can affect your behavior one way or the other. So it's sort of behaviorism is sort of nature. The mature point of view is nature, genetics, plus behaviorism, nurture. Okay? Now, the behaviorists focused on two primary models of learning. Okay, these two primary models of learning. Now, you all know that you can watch somebody and learn, monkey see, monkey do, right? Modeling and imitation. But the behaviorists didn't really accept that kind of learning at first because modeling requires that you have a mind, that you be able to think and represent something. And since the behaviorists couldn't measure it, they said it was not worthy of study. All right. And so they sort of ignored modeling for the first 20 or 30 years of behaviorism. And instead, they focused on two kinds of learning. Learning by association, all right, which is just two things co-occur and they stimulate neurons in your brain and you begin to associate those two events. Okay, that's passive learning. You're just an animal in an environment and two different sensations occur at the same time and you learn to associate those. That's passive learning. And then tomorrow, or Thursday, I should say, we're going to talk about operant conditioning, which is when you have an active learner that engages in random behavior and adjusts that behavior based upon the consequences. Things that lead to pleasurable consequences will tend to be repeated. Things that lead to negative consequences will tend not to be repeated. So those are the two models that we will call behaviorist models. Does that make sense? You know what? And so I'm going to stop because Tara wants to know, or let's see, who wants to know? Just somebody asked, can you train a pigeon? Noggin Leg wants to know that. I have actually got video that will make you think that a pigeon can read. How about that? Yes, you can train a pigeon to engage in behaviors. But here's the crazy thing. Pigeons also have good ideas too, which is not consistent with this model. So I'm going to show you a pigeon having what we would call insight, an aha moment, if you will. According to behaviorists, nobody has aha moments. Insight doesn't exist. But we're going to talk about that in the webinar this week. If you come to the webinars, I'm going to show you some really smart animals. So I hope everybody makes it to the webinar this week. Okay? All right. Actually, I tell you what, Morgan, I'm not going to send it to you. Come to my webinar so I can show it to everybody. I'm going to show you some cool videos of monkeys thinking and pigeons thinking and monkeys cooperating. And you're actually going to see in some ways monkeys are smarter than infants. And we're going to wonder if that means something when we talk about imitation. Okay? Now, what I want to talk about today is classical conditioning, which is learning by association. And really what it boils down to is we have reflex responses or unlearned responses, and we begin to associate these reflexes with environmental cues. Okay, so you can call it reflex learning. And in fact, Ivan Pavlov called them psychic reflexes. He didn't call it classical conditioning at first. He said, look at this. I have created psychic reflexes is what I have done. All right. Now, Pavlov was actually a digestion researcher. He was a physiologist, not a psychologist. And he actually won the Nobel Prize in, I think, 1904 for his work on digestion. And it turns out that we begin digestion even before food gets into our stomach. In fact, we have saliva in our mouth, and this saliva begins the digestion process. And it turns out it's a reflex response, that salivating is a reflex response. When somebody puts food on your tongue, when you taste pizza, when you smell pizza, you begin to salivate. Whenever something tasty is put in front of you, you begin to salivate. That's a reflex response, a digestion reflex that we all have. And he was studying that he would put a tube into a dog's salivary gland, he would put meat powder on the dog's tongue, and then he would measure the amount of saliva that the dog produced, all right? But what he found was that the dogs began screwing the experiments up because they started salivating too early. After having the meat powder placed on their tongues for a while, they begin to salivate when they saw the meat powder, even before it was placed on the tongue. After a while, they realized that the researcher went to the cabinet to get the meat powder. They would begin to salivate when the researcher went to the cabinet even before they saw the meat powder. After a while, the dogs would even begin salivating when they saw the researcher. And so Ivan Pavlov realized that the reflex behavior had been affected by environmental cues. So what he did was he set up experiments to demonstrate that this was in fact the case. And so what he would do is he would do this experiment where he would he would pair the food powder with a metronome. So he would play the metronome first, then he would put the food powder on the dog's tongue, and the dog would salivate, right? So he would do the metronome, put the food on the dog's tongue, the dog would salivate. And what he did was he would pair the metronome, a neutral cue, all right, with what he called the unconditioned stimulus, the food. Anything that causes a response without you having to learn it is unconditioned. All right, so the UCS. And then the salivating to the meat powder is what he called the unconditioned response. So he would do metronome, food, the dog would salivate. He would play the metronome, he would give the dog food, the dog would salivate. And after several pairings of the metronome with the food powder, he could play the metronome and the dog would begin salivating. And he then referred to the metronome at this point as a conditioned stimulus, and he said it caused a conditioned response, which was salivating in response to the metronome. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, when we get to motivated behavior in chapter 9, Riley, I will talk about hunger, but that's not going to be, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole if I start describing that, trying to explain that to you. Okay, so this is Pavlovian conditioning. Absolutely, absolutely. So here's the deal. Classical conditioning is very important in all of the things that you do. How many of you have a class that you are taking right now that you hate here at Wake Tech? Does anybody have a class? Okay. You know, I think what you're talking about is learned helplessness. Michael, we're not going to talk about learned helplessness until we get to chapter 10, which is motivation and emotion. Yeah, he did quite a number of variations on these dogs, and he found that you could actually create neurosis in dogs using classical conditioning methods. But no, we're not going to talk about this. Okay, so you hate statistics. Is it because statistics is hard, or does your teacher stink? Morgan? And the point I'm trying to make here is that when somebody is interesting, you enjoy being around them, right? How many of you like being around somebody that makes you laugh and makes you feel good? We don't have to really learn that. When we get positive emotion from a person, we feel positive. I'm going to argue that that's what we would call a reflex response. When I say something that's funny to you, you don't have to learn to like it. It just makes you laugh. And so you could say my jokey behavior is the unconditioned stimulus, and your enjoyment of the class is the unconditioned response, right? But here's the thing. What I do is I talk about psychology, which you don't necessarily have an opinion of when you walk in this class. And what happens is every day you laugh and you hear about psychology. And when you laugh, it's always paired with the psychology. And then after several weeks of coming in here and having a good time while hearing about psychology, what I find is most of my students say, you know what, I really like psychology. It's so interesting. Now, is it because psychology is interesting, or is it because you had a good time while you were hearing about psychology? We're going to call that a classically conditioned response. Now, why do you like the color red? Well, actually, we're going to talk about that tomorrow in operant conditioning. I won't talk about that. But I do want to talk about one other thing that he found, and that was what we call higher order conditioning. It turns out that once you condition an animal or a human to respond to an unconditioned stimulus, you can then use that reflex response, that newly created reflex, to condition a second behavior. So once Pavlov got the dog salivating to the metronome, he then paired the metronome with a buzzer, and he could cause the dogs to begin salivating to a buzzer because he had paired it with the metronome. He then took the buzzer and paired that with the light, and he found that he could cause the dogs to salivate to the light because they had been conditioned to salivate to the buzzer. And he referred to this as higher order conditioning. Does this make sense? I hope this makes sense. All right. Now, I'm actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to give you, if I can find my white pen. Hold on here. Do I have a pen that works? Let's hope. Yep. Okay. So what I'd like to do is to suggest to you, that what we think of as celebrity endorsement is actually a form of higher order conditioning. And let me show you why. A lot of us, I don't know if you knew this, but sports celebrities make a ton of money. Why is a sports celebrity worth a ton of money? Let me show you. I'm going to go to my whiteboard real quick. All right. So here's the deal. It turns out that humans love winning. That's the opposite of frustration. You could think of the opposite of winning as frustration. So success or winning is fun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest this is a reflex, and I'm going to say that winning is the unconditioned stimulus, and the enjoyment or positive emotional state is what we're going to say is the unconditioned response. Does that make sense to everybody so far? Right? Now, here's the thing. I'm a UNC Tar Heel fan, and so what I've noticed is that what I remember as a teenager is this guy named Mike Jordan came from Wilmington and began playing basketball for UNC Chapel Hill. And every time you'd see Michael Jordan, he'd be hitting the winning shot, and as a Carolina fan, I would go, yay, right? Because he hits the winning shot. So Michael Jordan hits the winning shot, and I go, yay. Michael Jordan then goes to the pros and joins the Chicago Bulls, and they stunk. And then Michael Jordan hit the winning shot, and the Bulls won the NBA championship. Yay, he did it once. Then Michael Jordan did it again and won another one. And every time you see Michael Jordan, you are associating him with the feelings of winning. So after a while, what happens is you begin to say, I like Mike, right? So Michael is now the conditioned stimulus, and this is now the conditioned response, the positive feeling for Mike. At this point, Mike is now useful as an advertising tool, because what you can do is you can add him to a product that you want people to like, and the positivity that they feel for him will then wash on to that product. So I remember he had a Hanes commercial, and basically it was just Michael Jordan rolling through the camera, wearing Hanes or playing with Hanes underwear, holding them, showing you, making cute little comments. And so you saw Hanes, you saw Michael Jordan, I like Mike. I saw Hanes, I saw Michael Jordan, I like Mike. I saw Hanes and Michael Jordan, and you know what? I like Mike. And after a while, my wife calls me one day. She says, I'm at Walmart and you need new underwear. Which kind do you want? Fruit of the Loom or Hanes? And you know what I say? Hanes. Wow. And I did that not because I care one bit about underwear types, but because when I thought of Hanes underwear, I thought of Michael Jordan, and that has a positive association in my mind. Does that make sense? So I would say that classical conditioning is, I would say that celebrity endorsements represent a form of classical condition, of higher order classical conditioning. Now, one of the things that he found was as you paired the metronome with the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response, the animal would begin to acquire the behavior. That's what he said. He called it acquisition of the behavior. However, if you quit giving the dog the meat powder and just played the metronome, after a while, the dog would decrease and then quit salivating. And he referred to that as extinction. But here's the crazy thing he found. That learning, even though it wasn't permanent, it wasn't gone forever, because what he would find is that later on he would play the metronome and all of a sudden the classically conditioned response might spontaneously recover itself. All right? And when we get to chapter 14 and 15 and talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder and other experience-related anxiety disorders, we may be talking about classically conditioned responses that just won't go away. So we might talk about this in context of post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. I don't do leopard print G-strings for underwear. Yeah, okay. Neither do I. All right. So here's the deal. John Watson felt so confident about the power of the environment that he even wrote this quote right here. Now, I took off the last sentence where he qualifies this a little bit because I want this quote to sound scandalous. But he says, give me a dozen healthy infants well-formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. Have you ever heard such an anti-genetic movement? Now, he said he came down this hard because he wanted to contrast himself with the eugenists who said that everything about you was based on your genes. But he really, really believed in the power, of the environment to affect behavior. And so what he wanted to do was to demonstrate this in a human subject. And he did this with little Albert. Yes, and he made he was very arrogant and if you will, confrontational in his statements. And I've even got a couple more quotes which you can feel more of his arrogance if you'd like. So he took this little toddler and he wanted to see if he could train a toddler to have a phobia. And so he took this normal kid, this little 18-month-old kid named Little Albert, who was not afraid of animals. He was not afraid of fire. He was not afraid of anything at all. And what he did was he paired presentations of a white rat with something that scared little Albert. And so loud sounds, well, none of us like a loud sound, but it really causes a child to become very scared. So what he would do is he would put a little white rat in front of Albert, and he would come up behind Albert and make a really loud noise by banging on a metal bar. And what he found was when he paired that loud sound with the rat after a while, Albert developed an aversion to that rat. Right? And he did this several times, and he found that after a while, he conditioned Albert to cry whenever he saw the white rat. And so in a sense, he demonstrated how the process by which phobias could be learned. Now, what he didn't expect was that little Albert became of lots of things that were similar to, but not exactly like the white rat. So he then became afraid of white bunny rabbits. He then became afraid of people with furry white beards. He even then became afraid of white blankets. And so what happened was this fear was so overwhelming that he generalized this stimulus to objects which were similar to the feared object. Okay? So in a sense, he showed how a phobia could be experienced. So you might have a bad experience early in your life where something was associated with a neutral stimulus, and you were so afraid by the unconditioned stimulus that you associated a negative connotation with that neutral target, and things that are even similar to that cause you to experience great amounts of fear. When you come to class tomorrow night, or if you want, you can go in the course resources folder. I've got a demonstration of a lady who experiences coulrophobia. Do any of you know what coulrophobia is? It's a very common phobia. It's the fear of clowns. And there are some people who are quite debilitated by pictures and images of clowns. And I've actually got a video of a lady going through exposure therapy trying to unlearn this phobic response. All right, I'm going to end with one thing. Now, since we know that phobias and fears can be created by the environment, one application of behaviorism has been the use of classical conditioning to unlearn fears. And so this is known as systematic desensitization. And systematic desensitization is, think of it as being the opposite of trying to extinguish a classically conditioned behavior. And what you want to do is try to present the conditioned stimulus without having the underlying unconditioned response. So what you want is to have the dog experience the metronome without the meat powder. So you don't want the person to have the fear while they experience the object again. And so here's how counter conditioning work. If phobias are learned through environmental exposure, they can be unlearned. And so what you do is you do two things with your student. And I said student, I meant patient, but I was thinking about y'all. What you do is you have to teach the person how to maintain a relaxed state, how to get relaxed. And that's not so hard. I mean, I could teach all of you. A lot of us spend our lives anxious and jittery, but you can have somebody sit down and teach you how to focus for a few minutes and how to calm your heart rate and breathing down, how to achieve a moderate physiological state. And so when you go in for counter conditioning, the first couple of visits, they're going to help you learn how to achieve a positive emotional state. During these first two visits, we're also going to have you come up with a fear hierarchy. So what I'm going to do is sit down with you and we're going to negotiate a list of presentations of the thing that scares you, going from those things that you could probably stand all the way to the most feared presentation of that stimulus possible. So if you're arachnophobic, okay, and we wanted to treat you, oh, by the way, they typically don't treat phobias unless they impact your quality of living. So most of the time, coulrophobia, arachnophobia are not going to be treated. If you're claustrophobic and you can't get in a car, or you're agoraphobic and you can't go out in public places like your job, they're going to treat that. If you have school phobia, they're going to treat that. But arachnophobia and coulrophobia typically don't get treated. But if we were going to treat arachnophobia, what I would do is I would say, hey, Edda, tell me what you could probably stand with a spider. Could I write the word spider on the board? And you'd probably go, you know what? I could deal with that. It'd make me a little bit nervous, but I could probably deal with that. That would be number one. Then I'd say, how about if I show you a picture of a spider and you'd be like, ooh, that'd be a little bit scarier than just writing it. But as long as it's a picture, I'd probably be okay. So that would be the second thing. And then we go the third thing and the fourth thing. And then maybe the top of your fear hierarchy would be having one of them furry old tarantulas in your hand. Now, in point of fact, we're never going to get to the end of the fear hierarchy. That's an end point that we'll never achieve. But what we want to do is remove the fear associated with lower levels of the stimulus. So what we do after we have a fear hierarchy and you know how to relax is I teach you how to relax. You get in a relaxed state and I start with step one of the fear hierarchy and I present the word spider and you remain calm while the word spider is written on the board. Now, if you start to lose your state of relaxation, then I erase the word off the board and we go back to your relaxed status, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that you're relaxed with each presentation. After a while, writing the word spider on the board will be so easy that you won't even have to worry about relaxing. You'll just be relaxed. We'll then move up a step in your fear hierarchy, and I'll show you a photo. And you might have to take it away a couple of times so that you can maintain your level of arousal. But after a while, you'd get good at looking at a photo of a spider and staying relaxed. And then what we would do is we would move up each step. Okay, does that make sense? And it's sort of a step-by-step process. And relaxation is the key. You have to maintain that relaxation. Now, in the video that I send you, that I'm going to show you about the lady with coulrophobia, they use a form of that, which is called exposure therapy. And in a sense, what they do is they let your fear run its course. Most people, when they see something that scares them, okay, they run away from it while they're at the height of their fear. And what most people don't understand is most emotional responses are going to have sort of a unimodal response. Your arousal is going to build up all the way to a maximum arousal, maybe terror, I don't know. But then it's eventually going to subside and go away when the fear doesn't materialize. And so one way you can treat a phobia is through exposure therapy. And what happens is you have guided exposure by a professional who walks you through an exposure to the feared event. In this video, they're going to have a clown walk into the room, and this lady's going to lose her marbles for about 5 minutes, and the doctor's going to be sitting there soothing her, almost as if she was a child, helping her fight those feelings, because eventually they're going to go away. And when they go away, she sort of realizes, she achieves, if you will, an enlightened state, and she doesn't have as much of the fear towards the feared object. Now, before the exposure therapy, when you're in a calm state, your therapist will sit down and talk with you about what's likely to happen when the feared object comes in. So they're talking to her, and the doctor says, what's going to happen when the clown comes in? She's like, I'm going to get really afraid. And he's like, okay, right. And is it going to hurt you? She's going to say, no, it's not going to hurt me. And they talk about what's going to happen before they go into it. So once she's in the middle of this emotional response, he can call forth these memories that she talked about during a calmer time. And so exposure therapy is sort of a shorter version of counter conditioning, in that a therapist walks you through exposure to the feared event, so you can experience the whole emotional trajectory and come down the other side. Okay. And I'm gonna, before I finish up, I'm gonna ask answer Michaela's question. She wants to know, how do you really fix somebody? Because what you're suggesting is that this is a guided environment where you know what's going to happen. But what happens when you open the bathroom door and there's a spider, right? That is a very good question. And really, I don't know if we can ever train you for that, Michaela, but what I'm hoping to do is to make it so that you can at least go into the bathroom when there is no spider. See, the problem with phobias is not that the person freaks out when they see the feared event, it's that the fear itself keeps them from doing things that they would otherwise do that may not have the feared event. Do you know what I mean? So if that's the response, and then Etta, there you go. I'm telling you, them Poles are some tough people. Etta's gonna retrain that spider herself. She's not afraid of a spider at all. I like that, Etta. I can't wait for you to teach the class tomorrow night. Okay, so step-by program for learning, and then believe me, yeah, right? So Spencer, if that's the response, then why aren't we taught to fight phobias? I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, Spencer. How do you mean we don't fight phobias? Typically, we don't, something is not a psychological disorder unless it impairs your functioning or causes you great anxiety. So if you're afraid of clowns and you just never go to the to the circus, then you may be deathly afraid, but it doesn't affect your quality of life. So we really don't fight phobias we don't fight problems unless they affect quality of life. You can't do what you need to do, or you're in a state of distress. And when we get to chapter 14, I'm actually going to suggest to you that the first thing they do is they don't diagnose your psychological disorder, but first they find out if your functioning is impaired. And then we look for a diagnosis. Okay? Why aren't we taught not to be worried? Well, the weird thing is, and this is what behaviorism, what B.F. Skinner argued. He argued was that unfortunately not everybody understands what he called the science of behavior. And he argued because we lack this, we often condition the wrong behaviors. So you might think that you are conditioning your child to be a good student, but if you reward them every time they're worried about a test, you may actually be conditioning your kid to have anxiety rather than to be a good student. Sometimes kids act out because they're lonely and they don't get enough attention at home. And so if the teacher puts the kid in timeout or yells at them or gives them a bunch of attention, even if it's negative, that may be reinforcing the child's behavior. We think we're punishing the kid, but the kid does it because punishment and getting yelled at is the only attention they get. So the crazy thing, Spencer, is that unfortunately sometimes we don't understand the ways in which we are negatively shaping children's behavior. And that was one of the major points of view of B.F. Skinner, who we're going to talk about on Thursday. Okay. All right. So does anybody have any questions for me? Any other questions for me? Looks like we've got 31 of you in here. Thanks everybody for coming again today. I hope this lecture was interesting for you. I hope you learned a little bit about Pavlovian conditioning and celebrity endorsements and how to treat phobias, because that's what we wanted to sort of cover this week. And I want you to know the crazy case of little Albert, right? All right, I'm going to go ahead and shut off the broadcast right now, but I'm going to stay on the chat bar for a couple of minutes. If anybody has questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them in the chat bar or via the Remind texting tool, okay? Otherwise, have a great day, and I will see you tonight in lab. Bye.